Good evening. My name is Jeff Schoenfeld, and I'm a proud supporter of the 92nd Street Y. I'm delighted to introduce tonight's program, Election 2020, What to Expect on November 3rd. We came up with this program entitled months ago, and it could not be more timely. Tonight's conversation is part of a new initiative from 92Y, Campaign for 100%. For the past several weeks leading up to Election Day, 92Y has been hosting an outstanding series of virtual events that explore how voting impacts individual lives, communities, our government, and society as a whole. Visit 92y.org/campaign for 100 to learn more. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's speakers, former Congressman Steve Israel and David Jolly. Former Congressman Steve Israel was a member of Congress for 16 years. He left Congress in 2017, having served as the House Democrats' chief political strategist from 2011 to 15 and chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. He is now the director of the nonpartisan Cornell University Institute of Politics and Global Affairs in New York City. He's also currently a political commentator, columnist, and novelist, having written 2 critically acclaimed satires on Washington. David Jolly also served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 2014 to 17. A student of the institution, David held virtually every position in Congress, from intern to member, and has worked outside the Congress as an attorney and political consultant, as well as in specialty finance. Today, David serves as Executive Vice President of Shoemaker Advisors Florida and as a political analyst for the networks and media platforms of NBC Universal. Congressman Israel and Jolly will be interviewed by my friend, Rick Salomon. Rick is a Harvard-educated lawyer and CEO who sits on many philanthropic boards, from the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Together We Remember to NYU's Of Many Institute. A good friend of 92Y, Rick is a frequent public speaker and moderator for many institutions in New York, Washington, and Chicago. Thank you to our speakers and to all of you for joining us tonight for what I'm sure will be a fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for making this evening possible to folks throughout the United States and overseas. And thank you to the Y, a venerable institution needed now more than ever during this continuing pandemic. Let's get right into it. On the eve of, actually less than 2 hours from the final presidential debate, assuming no one walks out. The title of our program, as Jeff indicated, Election 2020, What to Expect on November 3. Steve, as you know, and I think I mentioned to you, David, that's my birthday. So may I ask, what can we all expect on November 3 or shortly thereafter? Steve, why don't you start, and then David?
Well, Rick, thank you so much. Happy birthday, happy impending birthday. And let me thank Jeff Schoenfeld. And before we begin, I just have to tell you what a treat it is to be with my former colleague, David Jolly. I have to make a confession. When this sometimes gets awkward, but my job when I chaired the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee was to beat David Jolly. It's one of the reasons I left Congress was because I found myself in a position where we were fighting against people that we really admired and respected. So I don't know whether it was skills, David, or what it was. I just couldn't do it anymore. I had to leave. Very briefly, I think it's going to be a very close election. I think we have to remember that this election is now down to about 3% of the electorate because 97% have made up their minds. They're unmalleable in my view. They're locked in about 13 states that are in play, and maybe 30 media markets all told. And when you really dig into those places, you see a really tight election. And the last thing I'll say in my portion of answering your question is I have a little trick. I think that there's a pretty significant undercount in President Trump's numbers. So when I see a poll, for example, there was one out today where Biden has an 8-point lead in Michigan, I deduct 3 points to capture that undercount. So he's got a 5-point lead in Michigan, and that's pretty good in Michigan because the Democrats lost it. But when you apply that methodology and you try and factor in the undercount, you have an election that, despite the national polls, I think will be fairly close in those battleground states.
David?
Yeah, look, I think we're at the point now, 12 days out, where we're going to begin to see the election break in one direction or another. And I think it would be easy to take Steve's perspective that this thing could very well tighten. And particularly if you consider some of the Trump supporters that don't really poll perhaps as visibly as some of the other voters. But we could be looking at a 2018 scenario where Democrats start to expand the map. And certainly when you look at down ballot races, it would appear that to be the case. And so it's hard to see an environment where where down ballot races like the Senate in Arizona and Colorado and North Carolina and Maine break towards Democrats, but yet the presidential race tightens up. And so, you know, if I were to cast any odds tonight, it would be that it looks like things are breaking Democrats' way, because those down ballot races continue to show week over week the polling, Democrats outperforming Republicans in ways we haven't seen in past elections. And I would also say the headwind that the president faces is this. We know the polling around the horse races. You can break it down to the presidential race and the Electoral College however you want. But we have an incumbent president who's standing for re-election when week over week, the one poll number that I keep coming back to that has been evident for now 3+ months, when a person is asked, is the nation going in the right direction or the wrong direction? Nearly 70% says we're going in the wrong direction. And so even if there are available late breaking voters, that number is one that is hard for the president to overcome. And I would suggest, to the president's detriment, to his fault, he has not tried to reset that narrative. He has not been a disciplined candidate trying to tell people, yes, we are going in the right direction. He instead has deployed a campaign that is trying to contrast the candidates by painting Vice President Biden with the tag of corruption and socialism. That doesn't address the headwind that the president has, which is 70% of the nation thinks we're going in the wrong direction.
Steve, you want to add before I go on?
Sure. I'll just add briefly. I agree with David's assessment. Look, I'm still hungover from 2016. I have PTSD from that night where, you know, I walked onto a stage at the New York Times and said, within 3 hours, Hillary Clinton will be the next president of the United States. So if you're a Democrat who remembers that, you have a kind of a bleak outlook. But let me just reflect something that David said in Trump's numbers. What puzzles me is that he has adopted a strategy of not breaking out of like a 42% ceiling. Right? In order to win this election, he's got to at some point expand out of his base, get those suburban moderates, get those women, get those low propensity voters who may have voted for him in 2016 and now are thinking twice about it. And he just hasn't done it. He certainly didn't do it in the first debate. He didn't do it yesterday when he attacked Fauci. It's as if he's doing everything possible to alienate that group of voters that he must begin to attract.
Right.
Yeah. Hey, Rick, if I could add to that, because Steve's exactly right. The president seems to be thinking that there are more voters out there that look exactly like that 42%, and there aren't. We learned that in 2018. The additional voters the president needs they don't look like that 42% that's always been with him. They look like that coalition that gave the House to the Democrats in 2018, and Donald Trump's doing nothing to try to get them.
You've both raised a host of issues. I guess one question to follow up on: how soon after Election Day, given the unusual voting that we're doing here and our pandemic, do you expect us to actually get the outcome? Are we going to get any real results on November 3rd, or is it going to be a week later?
Who's that to, Rick?
Either one of you.
Well, look, I subscribe to the conventional wisdom that on election day, the president's numbers will be encouraging for him, so much so that he may go out at some point during the evening after the polls close and say, I won. And then it is clear that the mail-in ballots, the absentee ballots, will significantly favor Democrats. And so Joe Biden begins to catch up. Meanwhile, every day that passes, every week that passes, perhaps as they're counting the ballots, Donald Trump says, you see, I told you this was fraudulent. I told you this was a hoax. I told you it was fixed. So I'm not going anywhere. I've won the election. So I think that we have a pretty turbulent, we can expect a pretty turbulent several weeks after the election before we know for certain.
David, you want to add on before I go on?
Yeah, I would just say one of the factors in this is Donald Trump's willingness to accept defeat should it seem obvious, because even if the number suggests he loses, but he turns around and litigates in a number of states to try to prevent the certification of electors, then we could end up actually knowing the data, but having a candidate that refuses to concede. And I think that would be the hard part for the nation to endure. I will say, the contrarian in me wants to say, this could be over early. If you look at, for instance, the crosstabs of how senior voters are trending. Senior voters right now are trending towards Biden at a propensity that would suggest this race could be over very early once we have results from Florida, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. Look, I certainly don't want to paint that picture, but that is a scenario, which leads me to the first part of my response, which is, do we have two candidates willing to accept the results, even if the numbers show that it is not going to be a tightly contested evening?
Yeah, you actually anticipated my comment on seniors. Just a question generally on polling, and Steve, you partially answered this, but 4 years ago, everyone got burned. Then there are polls that are well respected, like 538, that according to today, using 40,000 permutations, has it that Biden is likely to win 87% of the time. Do you feel that the situation today, either one of you, is substantially different than it was when the polling was done in 2016?
Well, actually, Rick, the polling on the national numbers was right on target. So every projection by every credible pollster was correct in the numbers. It was somehow conflating those numbers with what was happening in electoral college states where everything went wrong. One thing I don't, even when I chair D-Trip, I didn't really spend much time looking at polls. I like to look at trends because the polls can be wrong, but you can pick up trends in a poll. The third thing I would say on this is that there's the New York Times now does a fascinating graph where they say, here are the polls today. Here are the polls if they're as wrong as they were in 2016. And here are the polls if they are as wrong as they were in 2012. And when you look at that, the polls today show Joe Biden with like 335 or 340 electoral votes. When you look at if the polls were as bad as they were in 2016, it's still, I believe, as of today, a marginal Joe Biden win, but too close to call. So that's all very interesting and entertaining, but I want to validate what David said. The trends are more important. So kind of understanding where are seniors going, where are suburban women going, that's more important than looking at a static number in the pages of a newspaper, in my belief.
Absolutely. We should get into some of the states. Did you want to add something, David, before doing so?
I would just say two dynamics that are a little different. One, we have an incumbent Donald Trump, which means the views of candidate Trump are much more hardened among the American people. The undecideds we know are much smaller, and even the undecided now has a very strong impression of the president, whether it's positive or negative. And then secondly, if you look at the Democratic candidate in this race, Hillary Clinton, rightly or wrongly, was very well defined both by her own career and then the attacks of Donald Trump on her in 2016. And what we know statistically is that both Trump and Hillary Clinton were a net unfavorable candidate. In fact, I believe by some studies, they were the two most unfavorable candidates statistically in modern presidential campaign history. You don't have that with Joe Biden. And you even see, if you caught his commercial during the World Series, his closing message is very much one of unity. And I say he's getting away with it, not as though he's getting away with something, but it's working. And so going down the stretch, if there are late breaking voters, they are not having to decide between two historically unfavorable candidates. They're actually deciding between a president, an incumbent president that they know very well and have a strong opinion of, and in Vice President Biden, somebody whose closing message is very much an apple pie message. It is not one of division that they're seeing from Donald Trump. So those dynamics are different, and I think they play to Joe Biden's favor going down the stretch.
So would you say, David, and then I'm going to ask Steve, that Florida is more or less settled in part due to the seniors, or is it still very much in play? And Steve, I'll ask you to respond, and also Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I don't think Florida is ever settled. I think this is one of the Democrats' best years statewide. They picked up a statewide seat in 2018 for the first time in about 10 years, a cabinet secretary at the state level. And this will be the last time since Barack Obama really had a chance to win the state that Democrats have a good shot. But look, in Florida and across the nation, I joked actually with you all on this call earlier, it's all over but the voting and the cheating. I mean, if you get a race very close in the state of Florida, it can be contested for weeks on. And, you know, in Pennsylvania, it's an interesting one because it appears certainly through the polls that Biden is leading very strongly outside the margin of errors there. In Florida and in Pennsylvania, you have very diverse states, but I think it's very obvious in Pennsylvania. What is most obvious is in the center of the state, you have that traditional, or at least the Trump voter of 2016, kind of the populist, Republican-leaning, generally conservative, white, maybe college educated, but a large portion non-college educated, ag, working class labor that broke towards Trump, that Biden's trying to get back. But then you also have somewhere like Philadelphia where you saw Barack Obama deployed to try to turn out what was the Obama coalition that included a very diverse group of constituencies of color. And so they are having to mobilize and energize each of those constituencies. And that's a different campaign tactic when you're trying to get that very diverse white, rural, as well as urban constituencies of color. Thus far, Biden seems to be able to do that better than Trump in this environment.
Steve?
I just heard a great line recently. I'm sure David heard this, that when you look at Pennsylvania, you've got Philadelphia on the east side of the state, Pittsburgh on the west side of the state, and Alabama in between.
Yeah. we call it Pennsyltucky, Steve.
Pennsyltucky, there you go. Yeah. You know, Pennsylvania is a tricky state. This Morning Consult had a poll out that shows Joe Biden up 9. That's a pretty significant lead. If Joe Biden can take Pennsylvania away from Donald Trump, it really makes it much more difficult for Trump to find other states, which is why the Trump campaign has now, with the dwindling dollars they have, they just made a big investment in Pennsylvania. Very hard for them to win the Electoral College and lose Pennsylvania.
Absolutely. You know, it's also been said that states as far afield as Iowa, Georgia, and Texas, where there was added spending, are in play. Do either of you view those as possibilities? It depends, I guess, on the run-up, and as you said earlier, David, in terms of up-ballot and down-ballot races.
Yeah, look, I think each of those states, but particularly Texas, eventually are going to go blue. It's just a question, which election is it? Is it this one, the next one? Is it 4 years, 6 years, 8 years from now? And I would say in terms of presidential elections, if and when that happens, the Democrats could own the White House for a generation because it's hard to do the electoral math that gets a Republican in the White House without Texas. The other states you mentioned, I think we have some intriguing down ballot races, and we know Steve can speak to this as well. I know House Democrats see Iowa as an area where they could gain ground, and there's an off chance, actually, if this thing ends up in the House of Representatives, that those Iowa congressional seats could matter to which state delegation controls the House of Representatives in a contested presidential election.
Steve, you want to comment?
Look, I think Iowa is one of those states, one of the 7 clear battleground states. Biden is up 3 as of this morning in Iowa, which, according to my methodology, means you subtract 3, it is dead even. It is an absolute toss-up in Iowa. Going back to David's point, which I just before this broadcast, I moderated a conversation with Speaker Pelosi for the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. And I'll tell you, originally, beginning this cycle, the projection was that the Democrats would pick up as many as 5 seats in the House of Representatives, as many as 5. Now the projection is between 5 and 15. That down ballot effect is just extraordinary. And I think it's attributable to 2 things. Number one, a lot of those Democrats who won in 2018 in that midterm election flipped Republican seats in purple areas, really moderate areas. And Donald Trump, going back to my original point, he did nothing to appeal to those moderate voters. And so he is on the ballot in those moderate districts. And those folks have decided that they're going to stick with the moderate Democrat rather than elect a Republican, return a Republican who could agree with Donald Trump's agenda. And I know this is anecdotal, but I was just, I had just a few minutes between the Pelosi thing and this. So I turned on the television. Now we have 2 races, David, 2 really interesting races on Long Island right now, House races. One is an open seat for Peter King's district. The other is Lee Zeldin's district. And it was amazing. I just saw a spate of commercials. Had to be just one after another on the local news. And again, these are the purple suburbs on Long Island. Every commercial for the Democrats associated the Republicans with Donald Trump. So you saw Donald Trump's photo with the Republican candidate. And it was all about, you elect this guy, he's going to rubber stamp Trump. Trump won Lee Zeldin's district 2 years ago. So it's, a presidential candidate has coattails. And sometimes those coattails, just pull you to victory. And sometimes those coattails will strangle you. And those coattails right now are strangling a lot of these down ballot candidates on the Republican line.
Yeah, we need to get into the coattail issue more, but let me touch on for a moment the elephant in the room, which David adverted to, which is the Electoral College. Do you see any real scenario that there is a deadlock or, where it ends up being thrown to the House, or even come January 20th, we're going to have temporarily President Pelosi, which I can't imagine? Either one of you.
So I'll take the first crack at that because I actually have done some both research and writing on the 12th Amendment as well as the Electoral Count Act, the election of 1812. I actually do think because Donald Trump war games, all of these things, I think they have a strategy, should it come to it, to try to kick this to the House of Representatives. Now, I would say before we all light our hair on fire, that's actually a constitutional process. I was watching a new documentary on the 2000 recount, and it was interesting to see Warren Christopher in that moment say, no, we don't have a constitutional crisis. We're actually following all of the constitutional procedures. There is a procedure should the Electoral College either deadlock, or more importantly, I think the Trump strategy would try to prevent certification of states certifying certain electors, or in a state like Pennsylvania, pursuing competing slates of electors. And I won't get into all the complicating issues here, but the way it ends up in the House of Representatives is if it ends up having an open question coming out of the Electoral College because a state can't certify their electors or because there are competing electors. And then there is a procedure, and it can go any number of ways. And frankly, constitutional attorneys and lawyers disagree on a lot of these things. I would say it's never really been tested, and don't put it past one candidate or the other to try to test it once it ends up in the House. But one of the important things is that there is a procedure in which it doesn't matter who controls the majority of the House, which Democrats do, but instead who controls the majority of the state delegations of the House. In this environment, Republicans control 26 delegations, Democrats 23, I believe one tied. That's not fully dispositive, and it's not, as I mentioned, it's not worth setting our hair on fire, but I do think that the Trump campaign has a strategy to litigate some of the results in certain states, knowing there's a possibility this could end up in the House of Representatives.
Yeah, and Mark Kelly could change that if he won, but Steve, why don't you jump in?
Well, I think David is right. I think there is that strategy, not only to litigate it into the House of Representatives, but to litigate it into a Supreme Court, where President Trump controls, has a supermajority. Either way, this is a president who's not going to go quietly into the night. He's going to use every tool he has in order to preserve his power. And as I said before, I think we're looking at a fundamentally unstable climate for the weeks and months after the election.
Could I add something here? Because I think it's counterintuitive to how we sometimes think about it. And it's this: contesting certification does not have to be in a tight race, like a purple state like Florida. If you take the state of New York, where I know a lot of viewers and listeners tonight sit, the elections of the summer, the primary elections and state committee elections, I'm involved with a group, as you mentioned, the Serve America movement. It actually operates as a third party in some races in the state of New York. In that race, there was a precinct where I think maybe the Sam party had, give or take, 20 registered voters. And when the results came back for the Sam state committee slot, I think there were 81 votes. There's no possible way. There were only 20 Sam voters registered, but there were 81 tabulated Sam voters that night.
That's the way we do it in New York, David.
I know you do, but I use that as an example because the Trump campaign could lose New York by 50%, but could contest the results as being unable to be verified because of anomalies like that don't make sense. And so what's the remedy? Is it a new election? Is the Cuomo administration allowed to certify the results, even if you have those anomalies? And to Steve's point about who controls the courts, that's what's in Trump's back pocket. You go to a Republican-leaning federal bench and you say there's no way this blue state could certify their electors. Well, if you get a friendly court, what happens in that environment now? That question has to be decided by a court or by the House of Representatives. I hope we don't get there, and I actually don't think we will. But from a legal standpoint, I do think Trump's preparing for challenges like that.
Well, hopefully,
if I could just add to that for a second, if you want to appreciate just how bizarre it can become, let's say that the president decides that he's going to contest Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature. So the Republican legislature can say, look, we're instructing our electors to support the president, and the governor can veto that decision and put up his own slate of electors. It can be just one of the most bizarre. It will make 2000 Gore versus Bush look like a love story.
Right. We can only hope that some of the patterns that David articulated, and the fact that you have, whether it's early voting or mail-in ballots, over 46 million, CNN reported before we started this program, that may shift the night and the days after to be more of a coattail. So let's touch on the coattails a minute. Would the coattails generally, for the two of you, move from, as is normal or traditional, the presidential candidate down ballot? But you see races like in Arizona where they say that Biden might actually benefit from the strong showing expected of a Mark Kelly. Can it work both ways?
I'll defer to Steve on that one.
Well, it can. It's rare. I mean, look, if this is a referendum on President Trump, the vast majority of voters are going to go and go right down the ballot. Mark Kelly is running just an extraordinary race, raising money, just breaking records, other than Jamie Harrison, just breaking records on his fundraising. And so every race has its own dynamic. But customarily, if you're going to go by the orthodoxy, in a presidential campaign, the president has coattails, and it helps his party. In 2012, when I was DCCC chair, Barack Obama was popular, ran for re-election. We picked up 8 seats in the House of Representatives because of his coattails. 2 years later, when he was very unpopular, we lost 8 seats because of reverse coattails. So it goes in both directions.
Absolutely. Let's do a quick, before we get to a few other issues, including the fact that you guys are masters of bipartisanship, and I want to get back to polarization. But let's do a lightning round for a minute, the two of you each commenting on some Senate races. Let's start with, North Carolina, Tom Tillis. Either of you comment, if you would.
Go ahead, David.
I think control of the Senate and possibly the presidency comes down to North Carolina. And I can tell you that Republicans nationally already now about 10 days ago made decisions to start deploying their election attorneys to North Carolina because they think it all could come down to North Carolina.
Agreed. Cunningham is up a few points, had some turbulence related to some inappropriate comments he made. That should have tightened the race. We're seeing initial signs that it's tightening. I think David's absolutely right. That thing is a toss-up, and the entire Senate can be, the balance of the Senate can rest on what happens there.
How about Susan Collins in Maine?
I think, look, here's what the Democrats are banking on. Like they've got 47 seats. They expect to lose Alabama, brings them down to 46. They believe that they will win Arizona with Mark Kelly. They believe they will win Colorado with Cory Gardner, and they believe that they will win Maine, Sarah Gideon's race against Collins. Now that only brings them up to 49, and then they have some other states that that they're very competitive in, which is why I don't know how David feels. I think it's entirely plausible in this insane and volatile political environment that you're going to end up with a 50-50 Senate.
That's right.
You agree, David?
Oh, I certainly think that's the odds are probably on 50-50, but this is where, as I mentioned at the beginning, this could break one way or another. And if we really get in an environment where Democrats are expanding the map, then I think Maine and South Carolina fall as well. I put Maine and South Carolina in similar situations, though they're very different in their politics. Maine, because Susan Collins always seems to pull it out, and South Carolina, because it always votes Republican. If Democrats were to pick up Maine and South Carolina, you're looking like at a night, for instance, that we saw in 1994 when Republicans swept the House and actually beat the sitting House Speaker in what otherwise shouldn't have been a competitive race. The sitting Democratic House Speaker lost. I think if we're looking at a scenario where Maine, North Carolina, South Carolina start to go Democrat, to my Democratic friends, congratulations, because it's going to be a very historic night for you.
David, I was on a Cook political report. Can I just make this point, Rick? Is that okay? I don't want to. I just was on a Cook political report, a briefing, where they were saying that Republicans are now saying that if it's a 51-49 Democratic Senate, it's a good night for them. And the Cook folks were saying that they could see an outcome of Democratic pickups from 51 to 55. Now, I think that's really optimistic. But what's crazy is that the two Senate campaigns in Georgia are in play. Yeah. Georgia has 2 seats up at the same time in a special election.
Can I ask about
that? They could go into a runoff.
Yeah.
Right. So if they don't break 50%, it goes to a runoff. We may not know not only who the president is, but who has control of the Senate, right? If both of these things are going into a runoff.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about Georgia, but lastly, because I did an event actually with your friend David, Seth Moulton, for Serve America with Amy McGrath. What about Kentucky? Is there any chance that Amy McGrath will beat Mitch McConnell? Low chance.
I'd say it's more likely that Texas John Cornyn loses than Mitch McConnell in Kentucky. I know Democrats have invested a lot of their heart and soul into Kentucky, but that's just one I don't see. But, look, it goes back to what I said. In 94, nobody thought the sitting Speaker of the House, Democratic Speaker of the House, Tom Foley, was going to lose to George Nethercutt. But he did, because that ended up to be one of the greatest waves we've seen in modern political history. You could paint the case by the numbers with Donald Trump, a highly unpopular president, as I mentioned earlier, where 70% of the nation says we're going in the wrong way. Even Ted Cruz said a couple of weeks ago, this could be a Watergate year. And in that case, perhaps the McConnell seat ends up on the table.
Let's pivot to an issue you guys touched on earlier, which is a concern, I think, to the entire audience in the country, the peaceful transfer of power. Each of you for a moment speak to that, as well as what's going on in Michigan and Virginia and how concerning you have it. I know, Steve, you wrote a piece for The Hill about what the military would and wouldn't do, including quoting the Joint Chiefs chair. How concerned are you about this, whatever way the election cuts?
Nothing concerns me more right now. I'm losing sleep over this. You mentioned that I run the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell, and we're now standing up something called the Campaign for the Future of Democracy, because we are looking at a democracy that has eroded, whose norms have eroded so significantly. I'll give you an example. I was reading a piece in The Economist today. 3 years ago, when asked the question, if you don't get your way in an election, is violence an acceptable alternative? 8% of Americans said yes. This year, 16% of Americans said that violence is an acceptable alternative to a democratic election. You're looking at a democracy is more tainted, less highly regarded than ever before, not only here, but around the world. I mean, there is an authoritarian impulse that is taking over, that is just spreading in Poland, in Hungary, in the Philippines, all over the world. 30% of Americans have, according to a wonderful book called Twilight of Democracy by Anne Applebaum, 30% of Americans have a predisposition towards authoritarianism. Now, there are lots of reasons for this, lots of reasons. Some are economic, socioeconomic, lots of different impulses. Some of it has to do with 9/11 and the economic meltdown in 2008. But the end result is a very fragile democracy that can easily be exploited in an election and the outcome that we have now. And so I think the most important thing for us to do is build a greater resilience for democratic norms. We need to go to understand why 18% or 16 to 18% of the American people think that democracy, violence is an acceptable alternative. We need to build people's resilience against attempts to intrude on our elections, to erode democracy, to berate reporters, to berate judges, to vilify one another. And I'm sorry for pontificating on this, but I am more concerned about those months after this election than I am on what the outcome of this election will be.
Those are chilling numbers. David, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I had a conversation today. I have two concerns should we end up in a situation with a Donald Trump loss. And I say that because Joe Biden has given no indication that he would challenge the outcome of the election. Only Donald Trump really has. So we have to contextualize it around his decision making. I concern myself around matters of national security. And it may be a bad actor on the world stage decides to take advantage of an irascible and vengeful and unstable president, not with an attack on the homeland, but something like we saw the Turkish president, or what we saw in Saudi Arabia or Russia, something perhaps where a sovereign nation crosses the borders of another, and we have a distressed, or a stressed, I should say, multilateral Western national security coalition, because a Donald Trump as a lame duck is very unpredictable. So I concern myself first with matters of national security on that. In terms of protecting our democracy, and Steve used a very important phrase or narrative about our vulnerability and the fragility of what we have. I don't worry about the president's ability to hold on to office. The truth is, fortunately, because of our system of federalism, Donald Trump as president cannot control the outcome of the election. As a candidate, he has legal remedies that he can use. We've talked about some of those. But the reality is, if he loses the election and loses his legal redress, then on January 20th at 12:01, he becomes a tenant of the White House who has outstayed his lease. And there are mechanisms for that. I don't worry about him trying to hold on to power. I do worry about, as Steve alluded to, Donald Trump using the bully pulpit he has. And at that inflection, that leadership decision moment where he has to make a moral decision, whether he assures the nation about the outcome of the election or whether he stokes doubt about the election. And unfortunately, what we know about Donald Trump is he likes to suggest that he's been cheated. He likes to suggest that if he loses, it was because the system cheated him somehow. If Donald Trump succeeds in convincing 40% of the nation that we didn't have a fair election in 2020, if that's his final legacy, that in the next year or two, we are living in a country where 40% of the nation believes we don't have fair elections, that is what I worry about. Whether it leads to violence or simply a a deflation of confidence in the American electoral system. Donald Trump has that power. We've seen that in the past. Any president has that power. It's just we haven't seen a president use that power for ill intent in the past. Donald Trump could undermine the American confidence in our own elections just through the power of his words, not his actions. That's what I worry about.
Somebody close to the president told me that we Democrats are whipping up this hysteria that Donald Trump will not vacate. He said, "You're wrong. He's going to vacate because he's figured out how to monetize the resistance. That he's figured this out. He can buy a television network. He can charge people to come to the rallies. He can make money as the face of the resistance. And what are the consequences of that? Consequences are that Republican incumbents in the House of Representatives and the Senate will continue to be intimidated by him. Even if he leaves the presidency, they will continue to be concerned that he's going to tweet something against them or run a primary against them. And so he may leave the White House, but the Trump movement is going to remain, and he's going to stoke it up.
Absolutely. Let's touch on for a minute before we get to audience questions. The two of you, as I said a moment ago, are really viewed as, while you were in Congress, both serving wonderfully masters of bipartisanship. You both touched on, with these chilling statistics, the polarization in this country. So each of you address briefly how we begin, assuming that we get past this election, how we begin to heal our nation, and how do we restore not just confidence in the Senate, but some modicum of bipartisanship, as you did. I know, Steve, you talked about how you may have been part of this, David. You held dinners where you at a restaurant in D.C. where you brought in both parties. You talked for 15 minutes about what you disagreed on, and then the rest of the time about what you agreed on, and you agreed mostly on about 60%. But how do you fundamentally address the polarization issue for the country, which is very troubling, and also crossing the aisle in the Congress? You want to start, David, and then either way?
Yeah, sure. Look, and we could have a whole conversation on this, so I'll make it as concise as possible. We have a political system today that incentivizes partisan behavior. It rewards the fight, not the solution. And it has been 20 or 30 years in the making since the emergence of big data and big media. And frankly, some would say the jet airplane travel that allows members to really not be in Washington to get to know their colleagues. But we have constructed mechanisms that protect partisanship. And I know there's disagreement on a lot of this, but I'll just lay out three very clear ones. 90% of House seats are gerrymandered for one party or the other, and they largely operate in closed primary states. So the only point of accountability for a member of Congress, the only way they keep their job and get ahead, is to be affirmed by the most partisan voters in their district. There's no reward for them to be cross-partisan in public, to try to reach that consensus in public, because then they're seen by their hyper-partisan voters as not being a good enough partisan. Between gerrymandering and closed primaries, and then in today's campaign finance system, where the outside money dominates everything, the outside money behaves just as partisan as we do as voters. It is controlled largely by the party leaders. I mentioned those three things because until we engage in structural reforms, and voters have been able to do this in states across the country, Florida, Arizona, Maine, California, if we can unrig the system and create a system of reward for consensus and bipartisanship, then you'll see that on the national stage. Until we change the system of rewards for elections, I don't think we'll ever truly see the change in behavior, because whatever your walk of life, whatever your job, from law to medicine to a trade to politics, you're going to keep doing the things that get you elected. Partisanship gets you elected in today's political environment.
Yeah, David, you're absolutely right. When Eric Cantor, who was the Republican leader, lost his primary to somebody who thought that Eric Cantor was too liberal for meeting with Barack Obama to avert a government shutdown, Cantor was the canary in the coal mine. Yeah. Most members of Congress, to David's point, most members of Congress don't wake up in the morning believing that they could be defeated by somebody from the other party. They wake up in the morning concerned that they're going to be defeated by somebody in their primary to the further left or the further right. And part of the problem is us. When I say us, I mean the American people. We have split from one another. David Wasserman of the Cook Report, going back to that, did an analysis, fascinating analysis, where he took a look at districts all across the country, and he said, if you live in a district with a Cracker Barrel, your member of Congress is likely to be a Republican. If you live in a district with a Whole Foods, your member of Congress is likely to be a Democrat. If you live in a district where you have a Cracker Barrel and a Whole Foods, it's a swing district. Your member of Congress could be one or the other. So we're self-selecting. We're moving into neighborhoods where we feel more comfortable. We're watching either David Jolly on MSNBC or somebody on Fox News. We're getting this bias confirmation. Our social media is now, our news content is determined by algorithm. We read what is designed for us to read. And so we have been completely separated. How do you solve the problem? There needs to be reform of redistricting. It should be nonpartisan redistricting. And you have to create opportunities and spaces for members of Congress to come together again.
Absolutely. Let me get to some of our audience questions, if I may. One asked, do you have any predictions, either of you, for the debate tonight? How that happens, or whether it's going to be an implosion?
Well, look, both candidates have completely separate strategic objectives. If I'm Donald Trump, I'm trying to figure out how I make that first debate a distant memory, come as a different Donald Trump, and try and appeal to some people outside of the 42% base. If I'm Joe Biden, I try and sit on my lead. Trump's going to try and force Biden to stumble so he can validate the argument that he's Sleepy Joe. If I'm Joe Biden, I win by not losing, which is don't take the debate, stay in your lane, don't let Trump dictate the terms of the debate.
Yeah, look, I think for Joe Biden, the new rule that Donald Trump would be muted almost guarantees Biden the ability to get through this debate, delivering the message he needs to close this election, because he can deliver, I think, what we saw in the commercial during the World Series, which is we're one America, right? He's going to draw on some of on Barack Obama's themes of a post-partisan America, and it's very effective. For Donald Trump, look, they forecasted long ago that they were going to run this race just like 2016. They're going to paint whomever the nominee was going to be ultimately, even if it was Joe Biden, if it was Elizabeth Warren or Andrew Yang or whomever, they were going to paint the nominee as socialist or representing the party of socialism, and they were going to tag the nominee with criminality. That's exactly what they did in 2016, and it's Donald Trump's default, whether it's strategy or just his own gut and personality. The problem is, as we've talked earlier, that doesn't get you more voters. That gets you your 42% you already have. To get more voters, you have to address that one question we talked about earlier. More Americans than not today think we're going in the wrong direction. And Donald Trump, if he would shut up, could make a good case, at least his team could, about the economy and about whatever it is he wants to make the case around. We live in a partisan country. You're going to find a sympathetic audience to the case that Donald Trump could otherwise make about getting the nation going in the right direction compared to the Obama years. I know it's hard for Democrats to really get that, but for your Republican voters, that's what they're used to hearing. They're not even hearing that from a Republican president today. So I think Donald Trump, if he could resist the urge to go towards Hunter Biden and socialism, he could make a case tonight. It's probably too little too late, but he might try to make a case. I just don't think we're going to see that from the president tonight.
Steve, there's a question for you that David already commented on. What are you going to be looking for in particular and early on election night?
I'm going to be looking at David's state. I'm going to be looking at Florida because Florida closes at 7, right? Or except for the Panhandle. The Panhandle is time zone. So I'm going to be looking at Florida. If Joe Biden wins Florida clearly at about 8 o'clock, 8:30, I think it's pretty much over. It's going to be hard for Donald Trump to lose Florida and likely Pennsylvania and figure out where else he's going to go. Secondly, I'm going to look at a county that David may know well because he actually ran statewide in Florida. I'm going to be looking at Sumter County, which is where the villages are, right, David? That's the county where the village. So the villages are this sprawling retirement community, very heavily Republican, but they love their politics. And so they get on their golf carts, right? And they have Trump golf carts and Biden golf carts, and they just fight this kind of political war. If Donald Trump gets less than 60% in Sumter County, in the villages, and it's tight in Sumter County, that tells me that Florida is very much in play, that Joe Biden may win it. And so I'm going to be focusing on that.
David, you want to comment, given that you know Florida the best?
Yeah, look, I'd agree absolutely with Steve. Florida, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, in terms of East Coast races, are going to give us a very early snapshot as to whether this is tight or not. Interestingly, the difference in how Florida and Pennsylvania count votes will matter. You know, Pennsylvania was recently involved in litigation over whether they could even start counting their early votes before Election Day or not. So we could see late returns there. In Florida, vote by mail, they already count them. And at 7 p.m. on election night, at least for the counties that are in the Eastern time zone, those machines start running, and we get early results about 7:30 or 7:40 that give us a quick glimpse. The two things to look for in Florida, though, as Steve mentioned, the Panhandle is actually Central Time Zone. There's not a lot of voters there, and frankly, they tilt Republican, but for downtown Pensacola as a heavy Democratic district. But look for Broward County. Keep an eye on Broward County, I should say. Broward County is going to go heavily towards Biden. But as you watch the Florida results, Broward always reports very late. So if between 7:30 and 9 o'clock or 9:30, it's a tight race in Florida, check Broward, because they probably have not reported yet. And Broward will dump a ton of Democratic votes for Joe Biden. And that's when you know the race certainly could be over in the state of Florida.
Let's take two more questions. There are quite a few questions, and thank you both, on the whole issue of the administration of the election and concerns either of you have with mail-in and person, threats, things going on in the polling booth. Why don't you each touch on that, if you would?
Well, just today, there were revelations that the Iranians and the Russians have engaged in very active, sophisticated intrusion into social media. People received emails saying, if you don't vote for Donald Trump, we're coming after you. The speculation, and it is speculation, is that those emails were designed by the Iranians in order to taunt Democrats, just annoy them, so that they would go out and vote for Donald Trump. I don't think you need emails from Iran to convince Democrats to vote for Donald Trump, by the way. And if you talk to folks in the intel community, they'll tell you that the attacks on our systems are more sophisticated and more sustained than ever. So I am concerned about the level of intrusion and manipulation that foreign actors are engaged in.
David?
Yeah, I would just add, sometimes in politics, you just have to make a moral assessment. And this is an area where our incumbent president has failed to lead the nation in a response to what is an attack from foreign adversaries on our democracy. And we will always have lingering questions as to why. There are a lot of theories. But the reality is our nation was attacked in 2016. It's being attacked right now. And the president has a leadership opportunity, frankly, that would gain him politically among voters if he took a stronger position than he has, but he doesn't appear to. I would tie this question over the integrity of the ballot and early voting back to the last question with a little data point for you. We are seeing more early voters this year than we've seen in the past, and some it is because of COVID, the flexibility to be able to vote more safely, perhaps. Many it is because of the president's attack on the vote, on the safety of the vote. He has created these doubts about the safety of the vote. So you have voters like myself and my wife who would have done this otherwise, but not only did we early vote, we've gotten online to check the status of our ballot. Was it counted? I had a conversation with a leading Republican operative in the state of Florida, a very senior Republican operative. And in his words, this was 2 days ago, he said Donald Trump's Tweets and attacks on the integrity of the vote have decimated Republicans' early voting strategy in Florida, decimated it.
Yeah.
Now, he said the silver lining for Republicans, and part of this is just math, and it is a silver lining, is if the Democratic leaning voters that we're seeing early vote are your otherwise high propensity voters that would otherwise be voting on election day anyway, well, Republicans have more high propensity voters now available in the bank on election day to make up ground, right? If the Democratic super voters have already voted early and Republicans haven't because Trump has told them don't trust early voting, then by math, Republicans have more eligible and available voters on election day. I don't know if I fully, I buy the math, but here's the part that I don't know that his sentiment contemplates, which is how many new voters do we have? Right? How many newly energized Democratic leaning voters that we saw perform as blue voters in 18 that in previous elections haven't? How many of the early voters are we seeing? Are they new propensity voters? I think, the trend we're seeing is it favors Democrats and probably still will on election day turnout as well.
Certainly the young also, at least in many states. Last question. A number of people have asked about this. Concerns about the period between the election and inauguration day, those 78 days. How worried are you that, should, for example, Donald Trump lose, what goes on during that period, even though, as you say, David, there will be a peaceful transition, even if he overstays his welcome as a tenant?
Yeah, I would just affirm what I said before. I think the Constitution protects us from a president who wants to engage in misbehavior in this event. I worry about outside actors on the national stage. I worry about a national security moment just because we know of the president's irascibility. But fundamentally, and I won't belabor it, what I said earlier is what I worry about because I don't see a solution to it, which is if the president chooses to sow doubt about the legitimacy of the election, he will be very effective at it. And I don't know what the nation looks like if for the next 10 years, 40% of the nation says that in 2020, we didn't have a legitimate presidential election. If that becomes part of the psyche among the Trump elements of the Republican Party, that, as Steve said, will have legs long beyond November 3rd, I worry about living in a nation where the integrity of our elections is truly held in doubt, as a point of conviction is truly held in doubt by a large sector of the country.
I agree completely. We talked about litigating to the Congress or litigating to the Supreme Court. In the best of all worlds, even if the president does vacate his office, which he's required to do, I'm also worried about not a peaceful transition, but a disruptive transition. This is a really important period where a president works with his successor to ensure continuity of government, to ensure that the new administration has the information it needs. There have always been kind of games where supposedly folks took the W off every typewriter, every computer when George W. Bush went in. Okay, fair enough. But I do not believe that the Trump administration will send a signal to its own people and all of these agencies that they should cooperate with the Biden transition team. I believe they're going to say, be obstacles, stop them, disrupt them, do not cooperate at all costs. And that makes for a very rocky transition. Can I just say one other thing? I know we have to quit. We talked about despair. I'll tell you what makes me hopeful. I teach a course at Cornell University. Man, when I teach to these students, these undergraduates, I know the next several months may be tough, maybe the next several years, but this generation of future public servants, they are committed, they are passionate, they believe in democracy, they can debate agreeably. So maybe I screwed this up, right? Maybe our generation screwed this up, but I am so fundamentally hopeful, and I expect a really good outcome, strong outcome, because of this next generation that's going to be taking positions in public service.
Well, that's a hopeful note to end on. I want to thank our distinguished former members of Congress. Your comments really raised the plane and insightfulness on these issues. Steve and David, I want to thank the 92nd Street Y, Jeff Schoenfeld, for making the program possible, along with the Belfer Center for Innovation and Social Impact at the Y. And to our audience and to all of you, thank you for participating, and stay safe during these troubling times. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.